All right, so real quick, I want to walk you through an introduction to a Squirt build from Quad Standard Labs. Um, these two builds are identical-ish. Mine is this one has green motors, which are slightly different than the red motors over here. Same performance value out of both motors. They're just different motors. Mainly, this one was a color scheme request. This one also was a color scheme request, and they just happen to be here at the same time. But they do provide a dynamic or a variable that I want to talk about real quick in our real general intro. So we're updating the video today with these two builds. First of all, when you get your Squirt build, the props are already going to be installed. Make a note mentally of how these props are installed. They typically come from us unless requested a different way. They will come in standard prop orientation or standard rotation. This means that the trailing edge, which is the sharper kind of edge, if you would, typically is going outward when it's at the nose or the tail. So they slant outwards when they're at center right here. And obviously the opposite going the other way. This is because the props will rotate this direction towards the body, which means that the high side is the leading edge and is catching and thrusting the air downward. So your props will rotate towards the center of the body at the nose and the tail. This is particularly important to note, especially after getting it shipped to you, as well as any time that you're using the drone and it comes in at like a hard landing or bumps in or rubs on something, or just being transported to and from somewhere and or shipping. What happens is the props are on the drone, and as it's supposed to fly, you should not hear any rubbing when you move the prop after it's been properly aligned and ready to go. When you first put ducts on there, they will get a little bit of rubbing, which on this particular one, there's a little bit more. And this is because this is a colored TPU. The TPU that we use is a harder TPU, even though it is colored. However, our black TPU that we use is even harder. And so what happens is these ducts tend to be a little more flexible and a little softer, so to speak, and they get a little easier to move around and manipulate in the wrong positions. This one in particular has rubbed and caused a little bit of melting on the duct, which needs to be cleaned up. This can be cleaned up with a pocket knife or some sort of razor blade. You just want to gently scrape that little bit of excess that you can feel is basically like a little ridge kind of in a couple of spots. So that'll clean up any scuffing or melting that was caused. However, what you want to do is make sure that doesn't happen. And I can actually see why on this particular build it had happened. I'm going back against this one to kind of shave off that little edge. There's like a little ridge. There we go. And the props have a very small air gap, but you should be able to essentially get them to spin freely without ever touching. You can hear now that one is spinning free, and it's because I cleaned off that little piece of plastic that the tip was just hitting as it passed by. All the others are kind of pretty good. Now, while I was doing this, I did see what I wanted to show, which is especially on the colored ones, you will get out of alignment on this standoff sometimes. Sometimes it gets pushed down, sometimes it gets twisted on the standoff. And that goes for pretty much any of the standoffs. The rear one, though, being that it's easy to accidentally get pushed down a little bit, there should be no gap between the top of the TPU and the bottom of that top plate. There should be no gap. And you can see when you look at it, you will be able to see if the ducts are straight or if they are a little bit tilted or angled. If they're angled or tilted, you need to make sure that they're not. That's going to help you get the duct back into alignment where there's no rubbing on the props. Now, let's say that there is rubbing and you're trying to figure out why. The reason it's going to usually be rubbing is easy to spot if you look at the drone top down and you spin the prop. You'll see the little air gaps, and you'll see and you'll almost feel as you're rotating that prop when it starts to hit. And as you see where it is, what you want to do is you want to push the duct out in that area. But what you're really doing is kind of shifting it on these standoffs, the front and the side one on this one, and it's kind of helping shift it back into position. Again, they get, smashed out of position by when they get compressed or banged on or moved in a certain direction. So you want to just make sure that you just start pushing that way. You also want to like get your fingers in there, rotate them around with the props, and just spin around, making sure that it rounds out and make sure that it's actually the right shape. Once you do that again, you should be able to feel that they're not touching anymore. It's really, really important. So we've gotten you acquainted with the props and the ducts and those things. We've got our power connector here. It's an XT60. With the XT60, you're also going to find a USB port. This is for accessing your flight controller when you first get the drone. Unless you've gotten it with all of the gear set up and from us, you'll need to obviously connect to it, check some things out. Even if you did get a full setup from us, it's really a good idea to go ahead and plug into Betaflight and get familiar with how it's set up. So turn your radio on, turn your goggles on, verify everything is working, or bind to the things that you need to. We have our receiver, which is typically when it's got a receiver for Crossfire, it's going to kind of be hanging out, just floating around. We don't like to zip tie these things down because zip ties can kill stuff. This is in a position that we've done this for years, and it just floats around. You can tuck it up underneath, but we leave it kind of hanging out a little bit so it's easy to access when you first get it. Low stress, again, if you bang it around or something, it's not going to just get smashed or crushed on like something. It can move. So your receiver will be over here, your USB again to access stuff, XT60 to plug it in. Your bind button will be accessible from whatever side the light on the air unit is available. So when you plug it in, you'll see the light up. It should light up green, and then it'll light up red because it's not bound to. You push the button, bind it to your goggles and or your radio. If you have an S-Bus version, you'll want to make sure you do goggles first. Always do your goggles first, then you can bind your DJI radio if you're using that S-Bus. But you'll push that button each time to bind. The Crossfire, same thing, power the board with the USB and or with battery power, and then you'll want to go ahead and push the button one time. It'll start flashing, and you can then use your Lewis grips to bind to it. So that's going to be your walk around, your intro into the Shendrones Cinewhoop Squirt. We appreciate it. Fly safe, fly smart, just fly. Peace.